Thank you all for coming. I'm Tim Helwig. I'm the director of the Institute for European Studies here at IU, and this is a topic that's very much interest to me. Back in 2014, I was given some money from then West European Studies to do a little conference on political responses and policy responses to the economic crisis in Europe, and it has really gotten me interested in the topic. And here we are, sort of maybe a few years on, and maybe kind of 5 years on, with the financial, then sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And I thought it would be a good time to sort of take stock of how things are doing. A lot of the news out of Europe today has not been focused on the crisis due to other things that have pushed the economics off the agenda, I think, but nonetheless, that makes it especially interesting to revisit this issue. So this is going to be a roundtable debate, and we have 3 speakers who have generously agreed to participate. At the end, Michele Fraziani, who is the W. George Cannell Professor Emeritus of the IU Kelley School of Business and Professor of Economics at Università Politecnica della Marche in Ancona, Italy. We have, to his left, Istvan Benches, who's here on a Fulbright from the Faculty of Economics at the Corvinus University of Budapest, and he's visiting here IU this year at SUS and the Department of Economics, so we're happy he's participating with us. And Andreas Hauchkraft is here, who is an associate professor of business economics at the IU Kelley School of Business, and so I hope that they'll all have something interesting to say about sort of pathways out of the, taking stock and pathways out of the crises. So I've asked each of them to talk for 10 minutes or so, then I have some questions that I wanted to put to them based on what they talk about, and then I'd like to open it up into Q&A from the audience. So we can go in the order. Michele, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Maybe I broke the rules, but I thought the 4 slides would be one way to focus on a rather brief presentation. It has to be so because we are going to focus on particular items. My interest at the moment, today, is the architecture, the way the eurozone has been built. So I start with a slide about some history, if you wish. If you define a fiscal union as a degree of centralization in expenditures and revenues, there is a center. Essentially, there is a center. It spends and taxes, and then distributes, you might say, to the regions or the states, whatever. Yet the governance is. Then you might want to look at the data. OECD in 2003 did a survey of the type of centralization in spending and revenues and the way the center distributes. I don't want to belabor all the data, but what emerges, the interesting aspect, if you look at unitary fiscal union, there is a country like the US. So it's a one single monetary union, one single fiscal union, one single political union. If you look at countries like the US, actually the US is a federal, so in a way it's the one below. But if you look at a country like Italy, before joining the eurozone, the average expenditures at the center is about 70% relative to total spending, of which a good component goes to the subnational units, states, regions, whatever. If you look at federal structures, US, Canada, Australia, Germany, then that percentage at the center drops. Drops doesn't mean goes to 0. If you take a country like Canada, that percentage is 44%. If you take a country like US, it's 60%. This is data of the 20th century. It hasn't been revisited systematically recently, but I will be surprised if massive changes have occurred in that. So you have an idea from history that you need to have a center that spends and taxes for whatever reasons you might say. You can be agnostic about the reasons. Another history lesson is that if you look at countries that disintegrate, these are countries that have a political union. But when they disintegrate, the center disintegrates also fiscally. So for us, or for me, is fiscal disintegration important. When there is a disintegration at the center, the currency union disappears. So Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia. Now you might object to that. The eurozone is not a unitary state, is not a federal state, it's a collection, okay? So what does history say? Not very well. But I give you one example that you might want to revisit at your leisure. And to me, the closest example is the Austrian-Hungarian dual monarchy. This, roughly, the dates should be okay. 1914, for sure, is the end, and the beginning 1867. So it's roughly like the gold standard, you know, in terms of the existence. It was a customs union, like the eurozone. You had a common central bank, like the eurozone, but it had a decentralized fiscal system, like the eurozone. One difference between the dual monarchy and the eurozone is that there was no legislative fiscal discipline. In the eurozone, they had this sort of norms rules. You cannot exceed budget more than 3%. Your debt should go to 60%. Rules that are naturally violated. But anyway, that's a parenthesis. The dual monarchy had no legislative fiscal discipline and relied almost entirely on market discipline. Market discipline, higher interest rates, fiscal adjustment by either Austria or Hungary. You might say, it worked, but it couldn't survive the shock. And that's World War I. So even in that case, which I think if you reread, you have to read more than I've read, but there are people, unfortunately, we have one expert on this particular Austrian-Hungarian, it might be as well, this one, who might say more. But if you read, it's an interesting example of what it takes to survive when you are two countries. Now, you might say, why only two countries? Well, that's the closest example. The eurozone is more than two countries, so you have to accept more heterogeneity. You might say Austria and Hungary were less heterogeneous relative to the eurozone membership. Anyway, that's history. Now, I want to give you two reasons why the story of fiscal decentralization with common money cannot survive in the presence of regional, in the presence of heterogeneity. Country A is different from country B, B is different from country C, and so on. I give you two basic reasons. I'm not appealing to World War I, okay? I'm not appealing to the financial crisis. Those are easy. It's obvious that if you have some heterogeneity, you're hit by a war, you disintegrate. That's easy stuff. But I give you not too easy stuff. One is the regional asymmetries. You might say, why? Well, because all the countries that formed the eurozone have had strong regional asymmetries. Italy, north and south, actually north, south, center, more than north and south. Spain, Portugal, Greece, even Germany, some heterogeneity. Actually, there's a very good report of the 1970s called the McDougal Report, which is a big, thick thing done in 1977 that documents the degree of heterogeneity in the European regions way back and recommends centralizations of expenditures to the tune of 5% of community GDP. But if you don't believe that, you can go into the ECB, or actually the EU map. You can look at all the regions and then look per capita income and see the variety of heterogeneity that exists today. Okay? There are lots and lots of papers. Why fiscal union, in the absence of fiscal union with a common central bank, you have to worry about asymmetry. Lots and lots of paper. I'll give you only one quotation, and that's it. This is from Delors. Jacques Delors was the president of the European Commission. He wrote a report, which of course he handed to the people who were supposed to put together the eurozone. So they knew that. They all knew that. And if you read this, it's a very short but punchy structure. In all federations, what you need, some sort of a center that takes the shocks or distributes or compensates the shocks that happen to region A, region B. This is not an argument for subsidization. It's an argument that if you're hit by an event which you had not foreseen in region A, you need some shock absorber, an insurance principle. And all governments, unitary and federal, have this principle. Now, economists have debated how strong is the shock absorber. And you have estimates going from 30% to down to 10% of the ability of the center to absorb a shock from a region. You have a variety of estimates, but there is no one doubting that the center is absorbing part of the shock or compensates part of the shock that the regions are subject to. So that's, to me, an important principle which the eurozone does not have. The eurozone deliberately says no transfer union. It's in Article 103 of the treaty. You read it. There shall be no compensation. Each country lives on its own. Now, you might not like it or like it, but from an economic viewpoint, if you set that principle, you have already determined that the eurozone will not be able to absorb shocks at the periphery or even at the center. The second reason, it's even more subtle, and actually very few economists have thought about it, except Peter Garber, who was at Brown at the time, now is with Deutsche Bank. He's an advisor for Deutsche Bank. Wrote it in 1999, actually thought in 1998, at the very beginning of the eurozone, and sort of found a genetical problem. You would think that if you construct the eurozone as a common currency, there will be no speculative attack. How can you attack a flexible exchange rate like the euro? Now, when we teach, we say it's impossible. You can only attack fixed exchange rates. But here's the problem. The countries that constitute the eurozone all are linked to each other with fixed exchange rate. Unchangeable. The mark of Germany, the Deutsche, no, see, that's a slip of the tongue. The euro, the mark of Germany, is equal to the euro of Italy. Now, assume there are differences within the area, and think about that Italy has a huge deficit in the balance of payments, without mentioning what deficit. And Germany has a huge surplus in the balance of payments. And assume that German capital doesn't want to finance the Italian deficit, for a variety of reasons. Maybe scared, they don't like the lingo, there are all sorts of reasons why. They don't want to finance it. Yet, the currency union must work, which means that when an Italian importer needs to pay a bill to the German exporter, he goes to the bank and says, pay my bill to the German exporter. What does the bank do? The bank says, okay, I'm going to send my request to the Italian central bank to pay the Bundesbank. And the Bundesbank will credit the account of the German exporter. This must occur, otherwise the currency union collapses by definition. So what happens there, that you have balances, okay, plus and minuses within the eurozone. Italy will have a deficit, which is booked on the Italian central bank. Germany has a surplus, which is booked on the Deutsche Bundesbank. The aggregate value is zero, minus Italy, plus Italy. But that is not what counts. So assume there is a little doubt that Italy may not repay that deficit. Okay? In other words, Italy pulls out. The Bank of Italy says, okay, I have deficits vis-a-vis Deutsche Bundesbank. That's too bad. I go back to lira, the euro. I don't worry about it. Suppose there is a little doubt about that. Then you have the germs of a currency attack, like we've had in the last 2 years, which doesn't manifest on the exchange rate. Nothing to do with the exchange rate. It manifests on what is attackable. And what is attackable? Government debt. That is the significance of this second genetical problem. So you have outside of wars and cataclysm and financial crisis, you have two continuous problems in the structure. Regional imbalances and external imbalances, which are not homogeneous. And therefore, my conclusion is this, that if you have a heterogeneous membership, and it is heterogeneous, there is no question that Greece is not Germany, and Italy may not be Germany, it might not want to become Germany, and Portugal the same, and France the same. If you have heterogeneity, which means productivities are differences, rates of adjustments are different, and ability to fluctuate in price and wages are different, and you don't have a fiscal backstop. Backstop is the center. And you don't want to have a transfer union for whatever reasons, The northern Italians don't want to transfer money to the south of Italy. Well, the Germans don't want to transfer money to the Italians. I understand that. It's quite reasonable. But if you have that, then you are structured. And then what we do, since it's one of the questions Kim asked, you apply the wrong medicine during the last 2 years when you know that the problem has to be cured differently. You just don't say austerity, austerity, austerity when you know that the house is trembling, You can go down and dine with austerity because the house is not being put together right. So, and that's it.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, Michele. So Istvan is going to talk also about the architecture a little bit, did I understand it? Maybe from a different perspective, but please, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Actually, since I've known in advance that Professor Fratiani would talk about the weaknesses of the architecture, I decided basically to defend the architecture and probably to approach the problem from a different side. Of course, with the benefit of insight, we do know that the architecture is itself weak. But in order to finish this sentence of mine, I'd like to basically split my short comments into two sections. First would be a kind of historical approach to the problem, and the second one would deal with the more recent challenges. So, I think at the time of its conception of the EMU, so late 1980s and early late 1980s and early 90s, this was actually an incredibly huge step towards what we can call an ever closer union, and I would even assume that this was the maximum that was available at that time, and still it was quite a meaningful and robust, seemingly robust architecture. What happened exactly in the late 80s? Well, we know that this was the time of high inflation, low level of competitiveness in Europe, high unemployment, so Europe was basically suffering a lot. And then there was this wonderful plan of the single European market, which is mentioned Jacques Delors, and the godfather of the single European market was basically Jacques Delors too. And most importantly, this single European market had one strong pillar, capital account liberalization. But if you say that you want to go ahead with capital account liberalization and still you want to keep fixed exchange rates, then we know from actually the impossible trinity that we have to basically abandon national autonomy in terms of monetary policy. So basically that was, let's say, the external pressure on Europeans at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and the result was this, abandoning central banking autonomy, because the iron logic of economic integration basically just requested this. And from that point of view, basically monetary unification was nothing more than a kind of key, though technical complement to the single market, I dare to say. So then the question is this. Were then the godfathers of the European Monetary Union then simply reluctant or idiot or silly not to develop a full-fledged EMU by concentrating only on the monetary side? Well, I don't think so. Again, I must emphasize that back in the late 80s, early 90s, this was, again, a huge step, a quantum leap, I dare to say. But more importantly, I think EMU was based upon what we can call a kind of gentleman's agreement. What do I mean by this? Basically, everyone takes seriously what the game EMU meant. I mean the rule book. And point number two, that everyone was responsible for its own performance, for its own problems, and do not disturb the rest. Do not basically undermine the stability of the community. So, if we take it seriously that this was a kind of gentleman agreement, we can even actually argue that these gentlemen were otherwise quite smart guys, because in the Maastricht Treaty, they actually incorporated many important rules. Maastricht convergence criteria, the excessive deficit procedure, the no bailout clause. You're right, the transfer union was out of concern, but nevertheless, many different points tried to provide some stability to the eurozone, not mentioning the Stability and Growth Pact back in 1997. And of course, that was the assumption that if countries were willing and able to run more or less balanced budgetary positions, then in times of asymmetric shocks, due to regional differences, basically there would be enough room, ample room, to conduct countercyclical fiscal policies. Of course, on another side, these gentlemen, in this way, were myopic in the sense that their major concern was not really deficit, but inflation. But why? Because in the 70s and 80s, inflation was the #1 enemy, and deficit accordingly was seen to be only a second-rank problem, and even there was actually set up a kind of causal relationship between deficit and inflation. It was deficit which caused inflation, so that's why deficit had to be curbed, and not the other way around. More importantly, default. Yes, you're absolutely right that actually there's no default mechanism, there's no such a resolution mechanism in the treaties. But why not? Because again, this was a kind of gentleman's agreement. And gentlemen cannot go bankrupt, right? I mean, this is something that you cannot do. So default basically was not mentioning at all. And there was no mechanism for a kind of orderly default mechanism either. Nevertheless, if there was one single failure in the original architecture, then I think it was this. The failure to basically provide a regulatory framework for financial integration, basically the banking sector. But again, here, we may ask ourselves, was it because these people were not aware of these problems? Well, it's hard to answer. Again, think about the fact that capital account liberalization was put into effect just exactly in those years when the Maastricht Treaty was put together. And the single European market came into existence in 1993, 2 years after the treaty was signed, basically. So no one really knew in advance what could happen with capital account liberalization. I would go even further, and I would argue that everyone basically was happy about the new structure. This was the time when Europe did regain some power on international markets. We Europeans were actually really threatened by the Americans and Asia. During this days it was not China, by the way, but Japan and Southeast Asian nations. But due to the common project, mergers and acquisitions started to take place, and basically it's saying that Europe actually performed rather well. So, all in all, I would say that applying this kind of historical perspective, both the EMU and the single market were rather, let's say, nice inventions. And in the sense that on the one hand they provided some kind of institutionalized European answers to certain policy challenges, and on the other hand still provided ample room for national economies to exert fiscal policies, income policies, and so on, in order to exert their own national preferences, along their own national preferences. Now let me jump onto the most recent problems. So the team basically asked us what solutions, what fixes we can provide. That is, what should be done. Well, I think if the question is what should be done, then we should first address the question what exactly what has gone wrong in Europe. What sort of crisis actually do we have now in the European Union? Well, reading literature from this side of the Atlantic, it seems to me that this crisis is normally considered to be as a kind of European crisis, or in a more sophisticated way, a kind of eurozone crisis. But this actually is not really just a European Union crisis. Think about Ukraine. Ukraine was the first actually crisis economy in Europe back in 2007, 2008. Then, even within the European Union, not only eurozone countries were hit. Just think about my own country, Hungary, or Latvia, or Romania. All these countries were actually severely hit by the crisis well before the Greek economic crisis. So it's not something which is, let's say, a challenge only for eurozone member states. On the other hand, of course, we can say that within the eurozone, we have countries at the periphery, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, which were really, really hardly hit. But it doesn't mean that it is a kind of systemic crisis just because they are in the periphery. Within the periphery, we have very different crises. The Irish crisis is not similar to the Greek one, and so on and so on. We know very well that, I dare to say, it is only the Greek economy where basically public finances were not kept, let's say, on a sustainable track. In Ireland and Spain, they actually ran wonderful budgets. In Ireland, budget deficit was below 50%. In Spain, it was around 40%. So who could say that actually they were not disciplined? They were absolutely disciplined. The point is, however, that the financial sector was not regulated. And as I told you just in my historical reflection, this was in fact one of the most important failures in the architecture itself. So it means that when we talk about solutions, and accordingly we try to figure out what kind of crisis we have or have had in Europe, then we have at least three different answers. A typical, let's say, public finance problem in Greece, structural problems, competitiveness problems in Portugal, along with Greece, of course, and financial regulation problems in Spain and Ireland. And it does not mean, accordingly, that we could provide one single recipe to all these countries. Still, today, we call it as the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And I guess that's the most important reason why, from this side of the Atlantic, normally people refer to this crisis as the European debt crisis. But was it really a debt crisis at the beginning? Not at all. There was a decision back in 2008, October, just after the failure of Lehman Brothers, when Europeans, heads of state and governments, decided that every single member state had to bail out their own national banks. No one really actually took into effect, considered it as a relevant factor that these banks already worked on a single market. So every man for himself, I dare to say. And that was the point when, from late 2008 onwards, both in Ireland and Spain, budget deficits skyrocketed, and nowadays in Ireland it's about 100%. But again, this is rather a bad decision at the time than anything else. And if we want to really actually fix that failure, then it would be about creating a well-functioning financial regulation than anything else. Then 2 more minutes and I'm finishing it. It leads me. Oh,
I'm kidding.
So it leads to my very last point. Currently, actually, there are 3 different views with regard to the crisis. The German view is saying that, well, countries at the periphery did wrong, they should actually do their homework accordingly. Then countries at the periphery are saying that, well, Germans benefited a lot, so please, Germans, pay the bill. And there is this kind of, let me put it this way, French view, which says that it is governance or government what matters, so we need more European answers. I would say that where everybody is right and nobody is right. Why? Because I would basically claim that crisis, what we have today, is kind of it's simply meaning that EMU has been incredibly successful. Now, it might be counterintuitive, but think about this. What we have today is called this kind of crisis, protracted crisis. I could even call it a kind of muddle-through process. It's basically the result of a very successful 10-year-long period between 1999 and 2007. Why? Because back to the impossible trinity. There are now massive capital flows, but massive capital flows are paired with basically one single currency, no exchange rates. What does it mean? It simply means that those can benefit from the system who are competitive, and those will lose who are not competitive. What does it mean? The so-called good countries, Finland, Germany, or the Netherlands, have huge exports. Pluses, they are the competitive ones, they can save a lot at home, and accordingly, of course, their banking system, which basically has savings, would invest at the periphery. What happens in the periphery? Where the periphery basically consume the savings, channel the savings from the porous banking system, and basically invested heavily. What was the result? Bubbles, inflation, and of course, it basically, due to this fact, all the structural problems remained hidden. So, right now, what we have is that, on the one hand, we have deficit countries and sufficient countries, but if you look at the numbers, they are just mirroring each other's performance, basically. What does it mean? It means, and then I'm finishing, that yes, indeed, we need to initiate a reform in terms of the architecture, but I'm not sure, actually, that a transfer union would be